Before clocks counted minutes, before the constellations had names, there was a voice that brought order out of the void. Imagine light spilling over for the first time, a sky being measured into a dome, seas gathering obediently into their beds, and land rising like a memory of a promise. This is not a story about beginnings as a museum of curiosities. It is a story about beginnings that set the pattern for everything that follows. A covenantal refrain, the human condition exposed, and a God who, having made all things, enters into relationship with a fragile creation. We are going to tell the complete Old Testament in sequence like never before, not as disconnected chapters on a shelf, but as a single, unfolding drama in which promises are made, broken, and kept in surprising ways. Along the way, we will meet kings and shepherds, prophets and exiles, tents and temples, deaths and resurrections of hope. And through it all a thread runs, a God who initiates covenant, humanity that responds and rebels, and the stubborn persistence of promise. Prologue ends here, and the story begins. Chapter 1. The World That Was Meant to Be. In the beginning, the world came into being by decree. Light, stars, seas, birds, beasts, and finally humanity, created in the image of the Creator. To be made in God's image is to bear dignity and responsibility, to rule, to steward, to reflect the Creator's character. The first human pair lived in a garden that was both home and temple, a place where work was worship and presence was always near. But freedom came with risk. In the garden, a tree stood as a limit, a line drawn that would reveal whether love and obedience were free or merely mechanical. When choice turned away from the author, when the voice that once harmonized with God's will chose its own measure, the harmony of the garden broke. Shame arrived, with eyes open to nakedness. Fear replaced the easy fellowship of unguarded conversation. The world cracked along new fault lines, between humans and God, humans and creation, and between one person and another. That rupture is personal and cosmic. The fruit of one moment echoes across generations. We see it in Cain's trembling hands as he stands over the corpse of his brother, in the multiplication of violence and moral drift from one generation to the next. The narrative does not soft-pedal human failure. It does not pretend the damage is small. Genesis records the deepening of alienation, from sibling murder to social breakdown, from cultural creativity to instruments of domination. The violence grows until a sober, terrible judgment is pronounced. Yet the story holds both judgment and a thread of preservation. A faithful remnant is chosen in the figure of Noah, not because Noah is perfect, but because his heart, in the ancient author's telling, still leans toward God. The covenant that will color the rest of the Old Testament appears here. God acts to preserve life, to covenant with creation itself, and sets a sign in the sky, the rainbow, a promise that the destructive waters will not have the last word. Genesis 9:13. A brief interpretive note. When the text speaks of human corruption and of the causes for divine judgment, there are layers: moral, social, spiritual. Scholars differ on certain details, for instance the brief, enigmatic references to ancient sons of God, or the lineages that speak of mighty ones in old times. These are readings that deserve careful attention, and several mainstream options exist. We will name them at moments when they affect the flow, but always as interpretations rather than settled dogma. From Noah's family, the human story begins again, but a new sin surfaces, pride manifesting itself in an ambitious city and a tower that seeks to make a name for its builders. The response is not merely punitive, it is formative. God scatters the people, dividing tongues and scattering cultures, and in the process creates the variety of nations. The dispersion makes room in history for a different kind of beginning, not unity for its own sake, but the emergence of a people chosen for covenant. This, then, is the shape: a good world, a catastrophic rebellion, judgment that both punishes and preserves, and a scattering that prepares the stage for a singular call. From scattered tribes to a single man called, a new chapter opens, centered on a promise that will steer the rest of the narrative. Chapter 2. Abram. Promise in a foreign land. Out of the broken world, God turns to one man. Abram is introduced not by grandeur, but by the fact of departure. He is called to leave his land and his kin, to journey into uncertainty on the basis of a divine promise, that through him all the families of the earth will be blessed. Genesis 12:3. This is not an offer of comfort or immediate triumph. It is an invitation to trust. Abram's journey is the first major demonstration in the biblical story of covenant as relational commitment. God declares, and a human responds, imperfectly but faithfully enough to carry forward a promise across generations. Abram's path is complicated by human frailty. Sarai and Hagar, laughter and tension, birth stories marked by waiting and seeming dead ends. Twice, promises look as if they will be fulfilled by human strategy rather than by divine promise. Hagar bears Ishmael, a child who will become the ancestor of many. Later, Sarah bears Isaac in a miraculous reversal of the expected timeline. The text traces both God's fidelity and human attempts to fix what God is doing in divine timing. The climax of Abraham's testing comes on a ridge of stark drama. The call to offer Isaac, the child of promise, is perhaps the most unsettling moment in the patriarchal stories. Abraham's obedience, his halting, faithful steps towards surrender, and God's last-minute staying of that hand serve the narrative as a dark refinement of covenantal trust. The episode raises questions we still wrestle with. How does faith relate to obedience under threat? How does promise persist through trial? The text refuses easy moralizations. It leaves the reader with the weight of surrender and the mystery of a God who provides. As the promise moves on, Isaac becomes the carrier of the same thread. Marriage to Rebekah, the birth of twins, Esau and Jacob, and a family pattern that alternates blessing and deception. Jacob, the younger twin, in many ways summarizes the human condition of the patriarchal line. Crafty, grasping, yet chosen. His dream of a ladder reaching heaven at Bethel is a theological hinge. Even where human schemes attempt to seize blessing, the divine presence breaks into human history, promising company and covenant. Jacob's life is a study in the paradox of election. He leaves home, fleeing violence, and returns years later transformed, bearing a new name, Israel, after wrestling through the night with a stranger, a divine encounter that both wounds and blesses. The renaming is not a cosmetic change, it is narrative theology. The man who once tricked now bears a name meaning one who strives with God, and his offspring will become the 12 tribes that give shape to the wider story. But family life is messy. Favoritism, sibling rivalry, and the dark intensity of jealousy surface in the story of Joseph, Jacob's favored son. Dreams that speak of rising and bowing future realities provoke hatred. Brothers who can barely manage their own envy sell him into slavery. Joseph's arc, from pit to Potiphar's house, from prison to the palace, reads like providence disguised in hardship. At every turn, the narrative insists that God's promise advances, even when human choices are ugly. In Egypt, Joseph interprets dreams, stores grain, and saves nations from famine. His rise is both human triumph and theological foreshadowing. The promise that began in a tent will be preserved in a foreign palace. An application moment. The patriarchal stories teach us that God's promises often move through fractured human conduct. We see the persistence of grace, not because people are flawless, but because the God who calls is faithful beyond human fidelity. When we confront our own brokenness, we should not conclude that God cannot accomplish his purposes through us. Rather, history itself bears witness to a pattern, promise advanced through failure mitigated by divine sovereignty. By the time Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, forgiveness and reconciliation have matured in ways that none of them could have imagined. He names a truth that the reader perceives across the generations. What was intended for harm, God intended for good, to accomplish the saving of many lives. Genesis 50:20. That word, a theological judgment on suffering, does not erase the pain, but it interprets it within a larger plot of preservation. The family that began in Ur of the Chaldees has become more than a household. In Egypt, they become a people whose presence is marked by survival and flourishing in a foreign land. Joseph secures a place for his family. He arranges for them to settle in Goshen, and the patriarchal promise finds a temporary resting place in the banks of the Nile. If this sequence is holding together for you, if you want to follow how this single family becomes a nation and how covenant signs multiply into public structures of worship, then stay with us through the unfolding chapters. Subscribe so you won't miss the continuation of this sequence as we move from household to nation. Brief interpretive aside, when the text speaks of God's covenant with the patriarchs, the promise of land, descendants, and blessing, scholars debate the precise contours of these promises and how they function legally and theologically. Some read them as unconditional divine commitments. Others see reciprocal stipulations introduced gradually. Both readings have persuasive elements. For our narrative, we will follow the textual testimony that God's declarations set the course, and human response plays a role in the story's development. Chapter 3. From Family to People. The Gathering in Egypt. Time in Egypt does not erase the promise. It preserves and amplifies it. Jacob's sons settle, their numbers grow, and what began as a small clan becomes a substantial community. The conditions of survival in a strange land produce both integration and separation. They live under Pharaoh's provision, yet remain distinct in language, ritual, memory, and hope. The scriptural narrator watches the arc of time with a sober eye. The generation that remembers Joseph fades. A new Pharaoh rises who did not know Joseph. The memory of kindness can lapse into forgetfulness. The hospitable shelter becomes a staging ground for subjugation. The people who came as guests are set to the task of becoming numerous enough to be a threat in an imperial imagination. Labor and oppression ensue. The once protected family begins to feel the first pressures that will eventually lead to a divine deliverance. Here, the motif of presence returns. God had promised to be with a people. Now God's presence will become the axis around which deliverance is shaped. The narrative will move from the domestic institutions of the tent to national structures, law, worship, and identity in the wilderness. But before that, the crucible of oppression is necessary. It forms a consciousness of dependence and a memory that will become the basis for covenant law and communal identity. We are not yet at the mountain where law will be given. We linger at the edge of captivity, where the bones of a people are being shaped by work and sorrow. The story has established a pattern. God calls, human failure complicates, but God preserves. The patriarchal promise is not a guarantee of comfort. It is a guarantee that the promise will survive through unlikely channels and against human failure. A moment of reflection for us. When a community suffers under systems beyond its control, the biblical narrative does not answer with a promise of worldly ease. It offers explanation and hope, shaped by covenant. Suffering in the narrative is real. Redemption is real too, but often not immediate. The endurance and growth of the promise amid hardship teach that God's purposes can be worked out in and through seasons of exile. Closing movement. The family at the brink. Joseph's death marks an end to a personal story, but not to the promise it has carried. His embalmed remains, his entreaty to have his bones carried out of Egypt when God leads, are an act of faith that looks forward beyond his lifetime. The bones of the patriarchs become a physical and symbolic claim. This people belong to a promise that stretches beyond the banks of the Nile. And so we pause. The household that began with a call in the Mesopotamian dust now sleeps along the green of the Nile, multiplied and distinct. The next turn of the story will carry that household into a collective identity forged by suffering and deliverance, law and presence. A nation will be born in the crucible of resistance and memory. But the Israelites do not yet know the shape of that identity. They are numerous and vulnerable, and that is where the narrative will shift from clan to congregation, from promise kept in embryonic form to promise institutionalized in covenant law. The drama that follows will show how a people shaped by story and promise becomes a nation shaped by law and worship, and how the presence of God will be relocated from the tent of individuals to the tent of a nation. We stop here, at the threshold where a family in exile becomes the raw material for a nation. Behind them lie the garden and the flood. Ahead of them lies a mountain where thunder will codify how a people will live with God. The covenant thread runs on, taut and unbroken, tugging the story forward toward a larger horizon. Chapter 4. The God Who Delivers. Moses and the Birth of a Nation. A child is hidden in bulrushes and found by a princess. A life that begins in danger becomes the hinge of a people's destiny. Moses' early years trace a providential thread. Born to a people oppressed, saved by an enemy's household, schooled in palace and flight, and finally shaped in the wilderness. It is there, by a shepherd's patience and a stranger's loneliness, that the burning bush interrupts a life of exile. The voice that once spoke light into being calls a reluctant deliverer. "I will be with you," becomes the promise that will carry the narrative from family survival to national identity. Moses returns to Egypt not as a miracle worker, but as a mediator. The drama that unfolds, plagues that unsettle Egyptian gods, the institution of the Passover, the flight from slavery, and the spectacular crossing of a sea that becomes walls of water, is narrated in language meant to impress a theological point. God is the Lord of liberation, and history itself can be redirected when the living God acts on behalf of the oppressed. Exodus 3, Exodus 12, Exodus 14. The Passover becomes more than a ritual. It is a covenantal sign that life is marked by remembrance and deliverance. Crossing the sea brings the people into a desert that will test them more than the chains ever could. Freedom, the story insists, is not merely removal from bondage. It is the painful formation of a people under a law meant to shape them into a holy community. At Sinai, thunder and clouds surround a mountain while a people listen and tremble. The law is given, not merely as a legal code, but as a constitutive covenant, a way for a fragile community to live in the presence of a holy God. The 10 words summarize a life ordered to the neighbor and to God. The sacrificial system, festivals, and regulations establish rhythm and memory. Yet covenant formation is shadowed by human impatience. While Moses ascends the mountain to receive tablets of instruction, the people fashion a calf and a festival in its place. The golden calf episode exposes how quickly worship can become distortion and how presence can be domesticated into an object. Moses' intercession, the shattering of stones, the call to renewal, these moments reveal both the severity of covenant and the possibility of restoration when a mediator pleads on behalf of a wayward people. The construction of the tabernacle, a tent of meeting, translates Sinai's thunder into a portable presence. God does not remain a distant judge, but moves into the midst of Israel by way of a sacred tent, where rituals of atonement and presence are enacted. In the tabernacle, image and reality converge, a holy place that signals that in spite of human failure, God intends to dwell with the people who bear his name. Wilderness life is hardly picturesque. Manna from heaven and water from rock supply the immediate needs of a complaining people. Rebellion, leadership crises, and the sin of murmuring about food and security recur, reminding readers that the formation of identity is hard work. The wilderness is a crucible, faithful dependence cultivated through scarcity, community forged under trial, law internalized after repeated failure. Not everyone who leaves Egypt walks into the promised land. A generation hardened by doubt is numbered out, and Moses himself, though faithful, is barred from entering the land he helped shape. Interpretive note: Sinai functions on multiple levels in the text. It is legal, liturgical, and covenantal. Some scholars emphasize its ancient Near Eastern treaty patterns. Others highlight its unique ethical vision. For the purposes of this sequence, Sinai is the moment law and presence meet to form a distinct people, an identity that will carry the promise forward, even as it reveals the persistent problem of human rebellion. The march from mountain to border shifts the narrative to a new stage. The wilderness people are about to enter a land, but entry will require faith in God's promises and courage in battle. The formation of a nation completes neither in law alone nor in miracle alone. It requires both covenant fidelity and the messy work of taking possession. This brings us to the river that marks the threshold of promise, the Jordan, and to the leader who will follow Moses' death in sight of the land he never claimed. Chapter 5. The Conquest and the Fragility of Settlement. Joshua succeeds Moses with an imperative: possess the land. The crossing of the Jordan evokes the earlier sea, waters held back, priests stepping on dry ground, and the people's entry into Canaan is staged as both divine act and human obedience. Jericho's walls fall to the rhythm of trumpets and obedience. The city's collapse becomes a theological statement that the Lord fights for his people. Yet the narrative that follows resists a single triumphant note. The book of Joshua combines dramatic victories with uneasy settlements. Some cities are given over, some peoples persist, and the allotment of land becomes a patchwork rather than an immediate fulfillment. The conviction that the land belongs to a people formed by God clashes with the lived reality that Israel coexists with other inhabitants, adopts some of their practices, and occasionally forgets the terms of the covenant. The conquest is therefore both fulfillment and beginning. The promise is materially realized, but the people's fidelity is not guaranteed by possession. The pattern that follows in Judges reads like a tragic refrain. A cycle emerges. Israel turns away, God allows oppression under foreign rulers, the people cry out, and the Lord raises a deliverer. These deliverers, Deborah, Gideon, Samson, Jephthah, are wildly varied. A woman prophet judge who sings victory, a reluctant hero who wins by paring down his forces to show that strength comes from God, a Nazarite of prodigious force whose life reflects both consecration and moral ruin. Their stories are heroic and tragic, and the refrain that concludes Judges, "In those days there was no king, every man did what was right in his own eyes," sounds like a warning and a lament. The cycle exposes how fragile local freedom is without a stable central authority, and without a people shaped by a consistent internalized covenant. Deborah's victory is a flash of clarity, a judge who sits under a palm tree and calls a nation to faithfulness. Gideon's ephod, however, becomes an idol among the people. What should have been a sign of deliverance morphs into a snare. Samson's life reads as a compressed tragedy, consecrated for God's purposes, yet drawn into personal vendettas and sexual entanglements that lead to ruin. These stories are not moral tales with tidy endings. They are anthropological studies of a people whose identity is tested by power, sex, fear, and faith. An application. The Judges period teaches a hard lesson for any community that confuses religious memory with moral formation. Ritual and memory without internal transformation produce cycles of relapse. In our own contexts, the story warns us that communal identity requires patience, discipline, and structural formation to avoid relapse into self-justifying chaos. The longing for stability grows louder. A prophet emerges who will bridge the transition, Samuel, a child dedicated to the Lord, becomes a leader whose voice carries both priestly and prophetic authority. He anoints the first king at the people's request, a sign that desire for human rule can arise from legitimate needs for stability and security, even as it risks displacing God's sovereign rule. This tension between divine kingship and human monarchy will define the next chapter of Israel's life. Chapter 6. The Dream and the Cost of a King. Saul, David, Solomon, Israel's experiment with monarchy begins reluctantly. Saul, tall and impressive, is anointed to meet the people's need, yet his tragic arc reveals the dangers of a throne that is both a gift and a trial. Saul's failures, impulsive sacrifice, reluctance to fully obey the divine command, open the door for a new kind of leader. David, a shepherd who becomes a king, a poet who composes laments, a warrior whose faith grows as his fame expands. David's coronation signals a high point. The young shepherd who faces Goliath with only a sling becomes the model of a king who trusts God in ways that thrill the imagination. His conquest, unification of tribes, and capture of Jerusalem as a political and religious center point to the ideal of a kingdom united under a God-centered rule. David brings the ark to Jerusalem to emphasize that God, not the palace, anchors the nation. But David's life is not unbroken triumph. His adultery with Bathsheba and the arranged death of Uriah expose the tragic entanglement of power and sin. The prophet Nathan confronts David, and the king's repentance is raw and public, yet consequences follow: family fracture, rebellion, and violence. The narrative does not spare its hero from judgment. It insists that even a man after God's own heart bears scars from sin, and that repentance does not always remove the fallout. The Davidic covenant, however, endures. God promises a dynasty, a house, and a future that will bear fruit beyond David's struggles. 2 Samuel 7. This promise becomes a theological hinge. What the people long for remains tied to a kingly line and to the hope of a ruler who will finally secure justice and peace. Solomon ascends the throne in the wake of violent succession struggles. His reign opens with awe, wealth, wisdom, and the construction of a permanent temple in Jerusalem. The temple becomes a symbol of presence, made more permanent than the movable tabernacle. Sacrifice and prayer find a home in stone. Solomon's wisdom draws kings and poets to his court, and for a moment the dream of a unified, prosperous kingdom under a wise ruler seems fulfilled. Yet Solomon's later life reveals a familiar pattern. Political alliances through foreign marriages bring religious syncretism, heavy taxation, and forced labor sow seeds of discontent. The splendor that seemed to safeguard the nation becomes a source of fracture. The temple stands as both a triumph and a witness to the rule's instability. Stone alone cannot purify the heart. The dream of a stable, theocratic monarchy founders on human desires and compromises. The division that follows is not abrupt. It is the outworking of political, social, and spiritual strains accumulated over decades. The story moves from the high point of an established temple to a new chapter of division and prophetic confrontation. The Davidic promise persists even as kings fail. The tension between royal institution and covenantal fidelity tightens, and the prophets begin to speak with increasing urgency. Chapter 7. Two Kingdoms, Prophetic Confrontation and Moral Theology. When Rehoboam foolishly insists on heavier burdens, the nation fractures. 10 tribes rally to Jeroboam in the north, leaving Judah and Benjamin in the south. The northern kingdom, Israel, quickly institutionalizes alternatives to Jerusalem's cult, erecting golden calves at Bethel and Dan under Jeroboam's leadership. Political pragmatism becomes religious compromise. The prophets arise as the conscience of a nation, not merely as foretellers, but as moral theologians who insist that covenant requires justice, mercy, and fidelity. Elijah and Elisha stand as prophetic titans in a period of dramatic confrontation. Elijah's showdown on Mount Carmel with Baal's prophets, his flight into the wilderness, his theophany at Horeb. These scenes show a prophet fighting idolatry with boldness and, at times, loneliness. Elisha's ministry continues miracles and challenge. Prophetic authority is less courtly and more disruptive. The prophets do not only battle theological error, they call kings and people back to the covenantal standards that define life under Yahweh. The prophetic voices multiply. Amos speaks with a fierce ethic. Ritual without justice is detestable to God. Hosea uses marriage as metaphor. Israel's infidelity is spiritual adultery that cries out for covenantal healing. Isaiah writes with majestic scope, indicting social injustice while pointing to a future hope that compresses judgment and restoration into the same breath. These prophets insist the covenant requires public righteousness, not private piety alone. The Assyrian threat grows as northern Israel drifts into syncretism and political vulnerability. Prophetic warnings about justice and fidelity go unheeded. In 722 BCE, the northern kingdom falls, and its people are dispersed. The fall of Israel is a theological and historical watershed. It is not only a political conquest, but also an indication of the consequences of sustained apostasy. The prophetic tradition, however, does not vanish. It continues in exilic and post-exilic contexts, preserving a theology that will shape restoration hopes. Judah's path is mixed. Some kings, like Hezekiah and Josiah, enact reforms and seek to restore temple worship and covenantal fidelity. Others lapse into idolatry. The prophetic critiques persist: moral corruption, social injustice, and the temptation to rely on foreign alliances rather than covenantal trust. The prophetic message becomes sharper as threats loom larger. The prophets do not merely predict doom, they frame it theologically. Exile is the consequence of abandoned covenant, and yet within that judgment is the seed of future restoration. This theological tension, judgment that serves both as consequence and as purification, will find its fullest expression as the people experience the catastrophe of exile. The prophetic books do not abandon hope. Rather, they reconfigure it. They speak of a faithful remnant, of a renewed heart, of a day when the covenant will be written on the people's hearts. The narrative is moving toward a point where destruction will be the prelude to a new kind of restoration. Chapter 8. Exile, Lament, Vision, and the Preservation of Hope. The siege comes, Jerusalem falls, and the temple, the visible center of God's presence, lies in ruins. The southern kingdom's collapse into Babylonian hands is not a single event. It is a series of displacements, deportations, and profound theological disorientation. Jeremiah cries over the city. His words are a mixture of indictment and consolation. He speaks of a covenantal future even as he watches the covenantal center destroyed. His letters to the exiles and his laments articulate a theology that refuses to reduce God to a temple building. God will be found where God's people are humbled and repent. Ezekiel speaks from the strange vantage of exile itself. His visions are theatrical and haunting, the wheels within wheels, the dry bones that rattle and take on sinew and life. Ezekiel 37, the prophetic enactments that dramatize the fate of a nation. These visions carry a double message. First, that judgment has de-energized a people, leaving spiritual death in its wake. Second, that the same God who brings death can restore life. Ezekiel's valley of dry bones is perhaps the most arresting image of hope. God breathes life into scattered and hopeless remains. The prophetic imagination reaches beyond political restoration toward spiritual rebirth. Daniel offers another facet of exilic theology. Placed in foreign courts, Daniel and his companions embody faithfulness under pressure. In the fiery trial, in the lion's den, in dreams interpreted by a wise outsider, Daniel's narrative insists that God's sovereignty extends even over empires. The apocalyptic visions that close Daniel point forward. Earthly kingdoms rise and fall, but God's kingdom endures. Daniel's witness is both personal and cosmic. Faithfulness matters even in exile, and visions of the end provide a theological horizon for hope. Theological reflection deepens in exile. Psalms of lament and songs of faithfulness are composed. Liturgy develops around memory and promise. The experience of displacement leads to a new kind of worship that depends less on a temple building and more on a people who carry covenantal identity in memory and law. The prophet's themes, remnant, renewal, a new covenant, gain force. Jeremiah's promise of a covenant written on hearts, Jeremiah 31, reframes hope as internal, not merely institutional. Interpretive note: exile forces us to ask how presence is defined. For some, the temple's destruction would signal the end of God's activity. The biblical response is more nuanced. Judgment, yes, but also the preservation of promises through unexpected means. The theological imagination in exile moves from locus to people to heart. The anticipated restoration will not simply reconstruct the past, but reconstitute identity. The empire that exiles Israel is itself fragile. Empires shift. Mighty Babylonian rulers give way to Persian conquerors. Cyrus of Persia acts in the biblical story as an instrument for return. His decree permits exiles to go home. The possibility of return raises the question, can ruins be rebuilt? Can identity wounded by catastrophe be healed by reconstruction? The answer will be partial, tentative, and yet significant, a restoration that will look forward as much as backward. Chapter 9. Return, Rebuilding, and the New Shape of Covenant Life. The return under leaders like Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah is halting but hopeful. The temple is rebuilt amid opposition, its foundations celebrated amid tears. Haggai and Zechariah exhort the people to finish the house of the Lord, Haggai 1:2. Their prophetic words frame the work as not merely architectural, but spiritual renewal. The restored temple is smaller and humbler than Solomon's, but its reconstruction signifies that God's promises remain active. Ezra reintroduces the law to a people learning to live in the shadow of imperial rule. He reads the Torah publicly. The people listen and weep, confessing sins and committing to covenantal renewal. The reading of the law signals that identity under God is centered in a revealed word that shapes community life. Nehemiah's energy is civic. Walls rebuilt under his oversight provide physical security that enables spiritual reform. He confronts social injustice, reorders the community, and insists that covenant fidelity requires economic and social integrity as much as liturgical observance. Restoration is not a return to a golden age. The community remains small, politically dependent, and exposed to external pressures. Foreign influences and internal laxity persist. The post-exilic period is a time of reformation. Liturgy is recast, the calendar is observed anew, and prophetic voices continue to call for purity and trust. Malachi ends the prophetic corpus with sharp indictments, priests and people accused of failing their covenantal responsibilities, and with a voice promising the coming of a messenger who will prepare the way. The canon closes with expectation ringing in its ears. Theological emphasis shifts in these years. The temple and the law are restored, but the hope of a Davidic king who will secure justice and peace seems delayed. The prophetic promise of a renewed heart and a restored kingdom remains open-ended. God's faithfulness has not failed, but the fulfillment anticipated by many remains future. The community learns to carry hope, not only in stones and scrolls, but in memory, worship, and a living expectation. Application. The return teaches us that second chances are real but rarely perfect. Renewal requires work, physical labor, liturgical reform, and moral courage. It also requires patience. Restoration often arrives in stages. For faith communities today, the post-exilic model offers both realism and hope. Rebuild faithfully where you are, but do so with an eye toward the promises that shape longing. Epilogue. The horizon of promise. The Old Testament closes not with finality, but with expectancy. From Eden to temple, from a promise whispered to Abram to the walls rebuilt under Nehemiah, the story has been a long arc of promise, rupture, judgment, mercy, and renewal. A recurring pattern emerges. God initiates a covenant. People respond, often fail. Judgment follows, mercy endures, and a renewed hope appears. Through tents and temples, exiles and returns, a single thread runs, an expectation of a righteous ruler, a restoration of creation's order, and a reconstitution of a people in intimate relationship with their God. If we trace that thread carefully, the messianic horizon becomes clearer. From seed, from tribe, from covenant law, from prophetic visions of a suffering servant and a triumphant king, the Old Testament prepares a people to recognize a new kind of fulfillment. It does not promise the exact form that fulfillment will take. It shapes hearts to long for it. This is why the story matters as a sequence. Each episode, garden, flood, promise, exodus, law, conquest, kingship, exile, return, functions like a note in a long symphony, whose final movements we will meet in the New Testament. What then should we carry away? First, a sober humility. History is weighty and even faithful leaders err. Second, hope. Mercy recurs and God's faithfulness persists. Third, a call to fidelity. Covenantal life requires justice, compassion, and worship that transforms behavior. And finally, curiosity. This narrative sequence has not concluded. It points beyond itself to a person and a movement that claim to fulfill what the Old Testament prepares to expect. If the sweep of this story has moved you, if particular figures, whether Abraham's fragile trust, Moses' intercession, David's broken repentance, or the prophet's steady courage, have lodged in your heart, then carry that curiosity onward. There is a next chapter that answers the claims of the old with a life, a death, and a resurrection that Christians read as the climactic response to this ancient promise. Before we close, one final pastoral note. The Old Testament's message is both communal and personal. It instructs nations and shapes individual souls. It invites us to hold our failures and our hopes before a God who works through imperfect vessels. The arc of Scripture asks us to inhabit both honesty and hope, to remember where we have gone wrong, and to trust that the God who begins covenants is also the God who keeps them. If you want to continue this sequence and see how the promised horizon takes shape in the life of Jesus and the movement that follows, subscribe and come with us into the New Testament story. Tell us in the comments which character from the Old Testament moved you most. Was it the repentant king, the patient prophet, the exiled visionary, or the surprising servant? Share your thought and join the conversation as we move from promise to fulfillment.